August 23, 1939. The summer heat in Tokyo pressed down upon the Imperial General Headquarters like a suffocating blanket, the humidity so thick that officers dabbed constantly at their foreheads with white handkerchiefs. Inside the secure communications room on the third floor of the Army Ministry building, Lieutenant Colonel Kenryo Sato sat before a decoded message that had arrived just moments before from the Japanese embassy in Berlin. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words again, certain there must be some error in the transmission. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. The two nations that represented the opposite poles of ideological existence, the very definition of incompatible worldviews, had clasped hands in friendship. And Japan, Germany's partner in the Anti-Comintern Pact, had learned of this through diplomatic channels rather than advance consultation. The men who had staked Japan's entire foreign policy on the reliability of German partnership were about to discover that in the world of great power politics, ideology meant nothing when national interest demanded otherwise. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What followed in the halls of Japanese power was not merely diplomatic embarrassment, but a complete unraveling of strategic assumptions that would reshape the course of the entire conflict in the Pacific. The betrayal would force Japan down a path that led inexorably toward a date with destiny at a place called Pearl Harbor. To understand the magnitude of the shock that rippled through Tokyo that August day, one must first grasp how completely Japan had invested in its partnership with Germany. The Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 had been more than a diplomatic agreement. It represented the foundation of Japan's entire strategic worldview. Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka, who would later become one of the most vocal critics of German duplicity, had built his career on the assumption that Japan, Germany, and Italy would form an unbreakable alliance against Soviet communism. The pact had been his masterwork, his contribution to what he believed would be a new world order. General Seishiro Itagaki, who served as war minister in 1939, had shaped military planning around the assumption of German reliability. Japanese forces had been positioned along the Manchurian-Soviet border specifically because planners believed that Germany would coordinate with Japan in any future confrontation with Moscow. The Kwantung Army, Japan's most powerful military formation with over 300,000 troops, stood ready to strike northward into Siberia at the appropriate moment. Everything depended on German partnership. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who would become Prime Minister in 1940, later reflected on the fundamental error in Japanese strategic thinking. "We believed that shared ideology created shared interests," he wrote in his memoirs. "We failed to understand that Germany would always place its own needs above any alliance obligation. We trusted where we should have verified." The first indications that something was amiss came through Japanese intelligence networks in Europe during the summer of 1939. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Oshima, the Japanese military attaché in Berlin who would later become ambassador, noticed subtle changes in the behavior of his German contacts. Conversations that had previously flowed freely about anti-Soviet cooperation became guarded and evasive. Requests for information about German military planning were met with polite deflection. Oshima reported his concerns to Tokyo, but his warnings were dismissed as excessive caution. The truth was that German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop had been conducting secret negotiations with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov for months. The discussions had begun in earnest in May 1939, accelerating through June and July as Germany prepared for its planned operation against Poland. Adolf Hitler needed to secure his eastern flank before moving west, and ideology proved no barrier to this practical necessity. The Soviet Union, for its part, welcomed the opportunity to buy time and to share in the dismemberment of Poland. Neither party saw any need to inform Japan. The moment of revelation came with devastating suddenness. On August 23rd, German Ambassador Eugen Ott requested an urgent meeting with Foreign Minister Hachiro Arita at the Gaimusho, Japan's foreign ministry. Ott, visibly uncomfortable, delivered the news that Germany and the Soviet Union had concluded a non-aggression pact. The document had been signed in Moscow just hours before. Arita sat in stunned silence for a long moment before asking a single question. Why were we not consulted? Ott had no satisfactory answer. Within hours, the news had spread through the highest levels of Japanese government, and the reaction was volcanic. Prime Minister Kiichiro Hiranuma, who had staked his political reputation on the German alliance, called an emergency cabinet meeting that same evening. The scene in the cabinet room was unprecedented in its emotional intensity. Hiranuma sat at the head of the table, his face ashen, as ministers arrived in various states of agitation. War Minister Itagaki was the first to speak, and his words captured the sense of betrayal that permeated the room. "This is worse than if Germany had declared war on us," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "At least then we would have known where we stood. This makes us look like fools before the entire world. We have built our policy on a foundation of sand." Foreign Minister Arita attempted to maintain diplomatic composure, but even he could not hide his bitterness. "The Germans have treated us with complete contempt," he observed. "They have made agreements with our principal enemy, without so much as a word of warning. The Anti-Comintern Pact has been revealed as a meaningless piece of paper." Finance Minister Sotaro Ishiwata raised the practical implications that would soon dominate Japanese strategic thinking. "This changes everything," he said. "We have oriented our entire economic planning toward confrontation with the Soviets. Our industrial production, our resource allocation, our military positioning, all of it assumes a northern threat. Now, what are we to do?" The most prescient comment came from Navy Minister Yonai, who alone seemed to grasp the long-term implications of the German betrayal. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this event tells us something important about the nature of our German allies. If they can reverse their entire ideological position overnight for reasons of expedience, what guarantees do we have that they will honor any commitment to us? We must now consider the possibility that Japan stands alone in the world." The cabinet meeting continued through the night, with ministers cycling through stages of disbelief, anger, and finally a grim acceptance of new realities. By dawn, Hiranuma had reached his decision. The government could not survive this humiliation. On August 28th, just 5 days after the pact was announced, Hiranuma submitted his resignation, declaring that the European situation has developed in a manner that is complex and baffling. It was perhaps the most understated political exit in Japanese history. The fall of the Hiranuma cabinet was only the beginning of the political earthquake that shook Tokyo. The Japanese military establishment, which had placed such faith in German partnership, now faced a complete reassessment of strategic priorities. General Hajime Sugiyama, chief of the Army General Staff, convened his senior officers to discuss the implications. The meeting, held in the war room of the Imperial General Headquarters, brought together some of the most influential military minds in Japan. Colonel Takushiro Hattori, who served as chief of the operations section, presented the stark military reality. "Our entire northern strategy is now in question," he explained, gesturing to maps of Manchuria and Siberia spread across the conference table. "We positioned forces on the assumption that Germany would tie down Soviet strength in Europe while we struck in the east. Without German pressure, the Soviets can concentrate their full might against us. The balance of forces has shifted dramatically against Japan." General Yoshijiro Umezu, who commanded the Kwantung Army, confirmed these concerns with his assessment from the field. "We have already observed Soviet reinforcements moving to the Far East," he reported. "They are bringing in new tank divisions, artillery regiments and aircraft squadrons. Within 6 months, they will have sufficient strength to launch offensive operations against Manchuria. We are no longer the hunters, we have become the hunted." The numbers were sobering. Japanese intelligence estimated that the Soviet Far Eastern forces would grow from approximately 25 divisions to over 50 divisions by spring of 1940. Soviet tank strength would more than triple, from roughly 1,500 armored vehicles to over 5,000. Aircraft numbers would show similar increases. Japan's position in Manchuria, which had seemed secure, was suddenly precarious. Admiral Osami Nagano, who would later become chief of the Naval General Staff, raised the strategic alternative that would eventually reshape Japanese policy. "If the northern road is closed to us," he said carefully, "then perhaps we must look south. The resources we need for national survival lie in the Dutch East Indies, in Malaya, in French Indochina. These territories are controlled by European powers now distracted by their own concerns. Perhaps this German betrayal, as painful as it is, opens a different path for Japan. This comment marked the first formal articulation of what would become the Southern Strategy, the concept that would lead Japan toward confrontation with Britain, the Netherlands, and ultimately the United States. The German-Soviet pact did not directly cause the Pacific conflict, but it eliminated the northern option that many Japanese strategists had preferred, channeling Japanese expansion toward the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The debates within the military establishment were matched by equally intense discussions in diplomatic circles. Ambassador Oshima, still in Berlin, found himself in the uncomfortable position of representing a partner that had been publicly humiliated. He requested a meeting with Ribbentrop to express Japanese concerns and to seek clarification of German intentions. The meeting, which took place on August 30th, revealed the contemptuous attitude that German leadership held toward its Japanese ally. Ribbentrop was characteristically blunt and unapologetic. The pact with Moscow was a necessity of European politics, he told Oshima. Japan should understand that Germany must secure its position before dealing with other matters. The anti-Comintern pact remains in force as an ideological statement, but practical politics require practical measures. Oshima pressed the point. How can Japan trust German commitments when Germany makes agreements with our enemy without consultation? He asked. What value does any German promise have now? Ribbentrop's response was chillingly candid. Japan must understand its place in the world order, he said. Germany makes decisions based on German interests. Japan should do the same. If Japan wishes to be treated as a great power, Japan must act as a great power, not as a dependent seeking approval. The ambassador reported this conversation to Tokyo with barely concealed fury. The Germans regard us as a useful tool, nothing more, he wrote. They will honor their commitments to us exactly as long as it serves their purposes, and not one moment longer. We must conduct our policy accordingly. The German betrayal had consequences beyond the immediate diplomatic humiliation. It fundamentally altered the balance of power within the Japanese government, strengthening factions that advocated different strategic approaches. The army had been the primary advocate of the Northern Strategy, and the German-Soviet pact discredited this position. The Navy, which had always been more skeptical of the German alliance and more interested in southern expansion, found its influence correspondingly increased. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and perhaps the most strategically gifted officer in the Japanese Navy, observed these developments with a mixture of vindication and concern. I have always said that Germany was an unreliable partner, he wrote to a colleague in September 1939. Now everyone sees this truth, but I fear that the reaction will be to rush into southern adventures without proper preparation. We must not trade one strategic error for another. Yamamoto's concerns proved prophetic. The shock of the German-Soviet pact created a sense of urgency within Japanese leadership that sometimes outpaced careful planning. If Germany could reverse its position so dramatically, the reasoning went, then Japan must be prepared to act with equal decisiveness. The time for cautious deliberation had passed. Japan needed to secure its future before the international situation changed again. General Hideki Tojo, who served as Vice Minister of War in 1939 before rising to become Prime Minister, represented this aggressive faction. The German action teaches us an important lesson, he declared at a strategy conference in October. In international politics, only strength matters. Ideology, alliances, agreements, they are all tools to be used and discarded as circumstances require. Japan must pursue its destiny with the same ruthless determination that Germany has shown. This attitude increasingly dominated Japanese strategic thinking. As 1939 gave way to 1940, the fall of France in June 1940 eliminated the metropolitan power that controlled French Indochina, creating an opportunity for Japanese expansion. The apparent invincibility of German arms in Europe suggested that Britain might soon fall as well, leaving its Southeast Asian colonies vulnerable. Japan had been humiliated by German duplicity, but perhaps Germany's military success could still serve Japanese interests. The Japanese response to the German-Soviet pact also had profound effects on Japanese-Soviet relations. Far from improving ties with Moscow, as some Japanese diplomats hoped, the pact increased Soviet confidence and aggressiveness in dealing with Japan. The Soviets no longer needed to worry about a two-front confrontation with Germany and Japan. They could now concentrate their formidable military strength against Japanese positions in Manchuria. This new Soviet assertiveness was demonstrated dramatically in the summer of 1939, even as the German-Soviet negotiations were concluding. At Nomonhan on the Mongolian-Manchurian border, Soviet and Japanese forces engaged in a major undeclared conflict that lasted from May through September. The battle was a disaster for Japan. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, who would later lead the defense of Moscow and the counter-offensive that destroyed the German army, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of combined arms warfare, using tanks, aircraft, and artillery in coordinated operations that shattered Japanese forces. The Japanese suffered approximately 18,000 casualties at Nomonhan, including over 8,000 dead. Soviet losses were comparable, but the Soviets could absorb such losses far more easily than Japan. More importantly, the battle revealed the technological and tactical gap between Soviet and Japanese forces. Japanese soldiers were brave to the point of fanaticism, but bravery could not stop Soviet tanks or counter Soviet artillery supremacy. The myth of Japanese military invincibility, carefully cultivated since the victory over Russia in 1905, was shattered on the Mongolian steppe. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the most influential staff officers in the Japanese army and a participant in the Nomonhan campaign, drew sobering conclusions from the experience. "We learned that courage alone cannot overcome material superiority," he later wrote. "The Soviets had better tanks, more artillery, and complete air superiority. Our men fought magnificently, but they were overcome by steel and fire. This is a lesson we must not forget." The combination of Nomonhan and the German-Soviet pact created what Japanese strategists called the Northern Deadlock. Japan lacked the military strength to defeat Soviet forces in Siberia, and without German pressure on the Soviet Western Front, there was no prospect of this situation improving. The dream of a joint German-Japanese campaign to dismantle the Soviet Union was finished. Japan would have to look elsewhere for the resources and territory it believed necessary for national survival. This strategic reality pushed Japan inexorably southward. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, Japanese forces advanced into French Indochina, first into the northern region and then into the south. Japanese diplomats pressured the Dutch East Indies for access to oil and other critical resources. Japanese military planners developed detailed operations for the conquest of Malaya, the Philippines, and the resource-rich islands of the Southwest Pacific. Each step brought Japan closer to confrontation with Britain and the United States. The irony of this situation was not lost on Japanese leaders. The German-Soviet pact, intended to free Germany for its European conquests, had the unintended consequence of redirecting Japanese expansion toward territories that would bring Japan into direct conflict with the Western powers. Germany had betrayed Japan in pursuit of its own interests, and Japan responded by pursuing a strategy that would ultimately drag Germany into a global conflict it could not win. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, who had been devastated by the German betrayal of the anti-Comintern pact he had worked so hard to create, now sought to salvage something from the wreckage of Japanese-German relations. In September 1940, Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact, creating the formal alliance that would define the Axis powers throughout the conflict. But Matsuoka harbored no illusions about German reliability. "We join this alliance because we have no choice," he told his staff. "Germany has shown that it cannot be trusted. We must use this partnership for our own purposes, while preparing for the possibility that Germany will betray us again." Matsuoka's suspicions were confirmed when Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, again without advance consultation with Japan. The news came as another shock to Tokyo, though this time the surprise was tempered by the experience of 1939. Once again, Germany had reversed its policy completely. Once again, Japan had learned of a major strategic development through public channels rather than alliance consultation. The reaction in Tokyo was more calculated than it had been 2 years earlier. Matsuoka, who had just returned from a diplomatic mission to Europe during which he had signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, argued passionately for Japan to join the German attack on the Soviets. "Now is our chance," he urged at a liaison conference between the government and military on June 26th. "Germany has opened the door to the destruction of Soviet power. If Japan strikes now, we can seize Siberia and solve our resource problems forever." But other voices counseled caution, and the memory of German betrayal in 1939 was fresh in their minds. General Sugiyama reminded the conference of the lessons of Nomonhan. "Our army is not prepared for large-scale operations against Soviet forces," he said. "We suffered badly at Nomonhan against a fraction of Soviet strength. How would we fare against the full might of the Red Army? And can we trust Germany to continue this campaign? What if they make another pact with Moscow and leave us alone against Soviet forces?" Admiral Nagano supported this assessment. "Our destiny lies in the south," he argued. "The resources we need are in Malaya and the Indies, not in the frozen wastes of Siberia. We have made our plans and positioned our forces for southern operations. To reverse course now because of another German surprise would be to compound German unreliability with Japanese inconsistency." The debate continued for weeks, but ultimately caution prevailed. Japan would maintain its neutrality pact with the Soviet Union and continue preparations for southern expansion. The decision was formalized at an imperial conference on July 2, 1941. Japan would advance southward, accepting the risk of conflict with Britain and the United States. The northern strategy was officially dead. This decision had enormous consequences for the course of the global conflict. Japan's neutrality allowed the Soviet Union to transfer critical Siberian divisions westward during the desperate winter of 1941 to 1942, forces that proved crucial in stopping the German advance on Moscow. If Japan had attacked the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, as Matsuoka urged, the history of the 20th century might have been very different. The German-Soviet Pact of 1939, by eliminating Japanese confidence in German reliability, may have saved the Soviet Union from destruction. The path toward Pearl Harbor was now set. Japanese planners calculated that southern expansion would inevitably bring conflict with the United States, whose Pacific Fleet represented the primary obstacle to Japanese freedom of action in Southeast Asia. Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied in America and understood the immense industrial power of the United States, warned against this course. "If we must have conflict with the United States," he said, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have absolutely no confidence in the second or third year." His warnings were overruled by those who believed that a decisive initial blow would shock America into a negotiated settlement. The example of Germany was cited in support of this view. Had not Germany achieved stunning victories through bold action? Had not the German-Soviet Pact, however shocking, served German interests by freeing Germany for its Western campaigns? Japan must show the same daring. A surprise attack on the American fleet would cripple American power in the Pacific and present Washington with a fait accompli. And so the currents that began flowing on that August day in 1939 carried Japan forward to December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded in destroying American battleships and establishing Japanese dominance in the Western Pacific. But Yamamoto's fears proved justified. America did not sue for peace. Instead, the attack awakened what Yamamoto called a sleeping giant filled with terrible resolve. The industrial statistics that had so impressed Japanese observers in peacetime now became engines of destruction. American shipyards that had launched a few warships per year retooled to produce dozens of aircraft carriers and hundreds of other vessels. Aircraft factories that had struggled to produce 1,000 planes per year multiplied production tenfold and then 20-fold. The American automobile industry, the largest in the world, converted to tank and truck production with staggering efficiency. By 1943, the United States was outproducing Japan in every category of military equipment by margins of 10 to 1 or greater. General Tojo, who became Prime Minister in October 1941 and who had been among the strongest advocates of decisive action, watched these developments with growing dismay. "We believed that American morale would crack under the shock of initial defeats," he later reflected. "We were wrong. They became more determined with every loss. And their industrial strength, which we knew about but somehow failed to truly comprehend, eventually crushed us." The final irony of the German-Soviet pact came in the closing days of the conflict. In August 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. The same Red Army that Japan had feared in 1939 swept through Japanese positions with devastating speed. The Kwantung Army, which had once represented the pride of Japanese military power, was shattered in a matter of days. Soviet forces captured hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners, many of whom would not return home for years. General Umezu, who had commanded the Kwantung Army when the German-Soviet pact was announced, and who now served as chief of the Army General Staff, faced the ultimate consequence of the strategic miscalculations that had followed that fateful August day in 1939. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Umezu signed the instrument of surrender that ended the conflict in the Pacific. The story of Japan's reaction to the German-Soviet pact illustrates fundamental truths about international relations that remain relevant today. Alliances based on ideology rather than interest are inherently unstable. Great powers will always place their own needs above alliance obligations, and nations that base their strategy on the reliability of others are building on foundations that may collapse without warning. The Japanese statesmen and military officers who gathered in those hot August days of 1939 were not fools. They were experienced professionals who understood power politics. But they had made the error of believing that ideological alignment created genuine partnership, that the shared anti-communist stance of Germany and Japan reflected shared interests. Germany's willingness to embrace the Soviet Union when convenient revealed this belief as an illusion. The consequences of this miscalculation were catastrophic. Japan was pushed away from a northern strategy that, whatever its risks, would not have brought Japan into direct conflict with the United States. Instead, Japan moved south, challenging American interests and eventually American territory. The Great Pacific conflict that followed claimed millions of lives and reshaped the entire region. Admiral Yonai, who had warned his colleagues in 1939 that Japan might stand alone in the world, lived to see his prediction fulfilled. Germany's eventual defeat came without any significant Japanese contribution to the European theater, just as Japan's defeat came without any significant German contribution to the Pacific. The Axis alliance, born in ideological posturing and shattered by national selfishness, proved to be one of the least effective military partnerships in modern history. Perhaps the final word belongs to Foreign Minister Matsuoka, who had invested so much in the German relationship and who had suffered so greatly when Germany proved faithless. In his final years, stripped of power and awaiting trial for his role in Japanese policy, he reflected on the lessons of his experience. "I believed in words when I should have believed in interests," he said. "I trusted signatures when I should have trusted capabilities. I thought that because Germany and Japan shared enemies, we shared purposes. I was wrong about everything. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.